sometimes in early mathematics we rush too quickly to what the child knows, rather than paying close attention to what the child is doing. Here, the doing matters, the process matters, the visible coordination of action and language matters. Now that kind of decision making is at the heart of a good curriculum design as well. And so, in the story of maths, one of the ongoing decisions is always about what to make visible, what to hold constant, and what to vary. The mathematical focus is one-to-one correspondence, then the presentation of the object is not incidental. It's part of the teaching. We want to prompt enough to support success, but not so much that the adult ends up doing the thinking. Now, if I hover over every object, tell the child exactly what to do, and correct them before the mistake is fully formed, I may produce a correct performance without building any real independence. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. In this episode, I want to explore a deceptively simple idea: counting, and in particular, one-to-one correspondence. Now, counting is one of those things that can appear so basic, so familiar, that we risk underthinking it. We hear children count, we watch them point to objects, we ask them how many there are. And because counting is so foundational, because it arrives so early in children's mathematical lives, it can sometimes be spoken about as though it's almost natural, almost inevitable, almost a matter of exposure. But of course, things are never that simple, are they? Learning to count is one of the great intellectual achievements of early childhood. It sits in that fascinating space between an intuitive sense of quantity, which humans seem to possess in some form very early on, and the much more formal, precise, disciplined body of knowledge that we call mathematics. And when you look carefully at what counting actually involves, you begin to see why it can be so troublesome for some children, and why teaching it well matters so much. So in this episode, I want to focus in on one specific element of counting: one-to-one correspondence. What it is, why it matters, what does it look like when a child does not yet have it, and most importantly, how might we scaffold towards it in a way that is thoughtful, precise, and ultimately liberating for the child. Because that's what good scaffolding should be. Not a crutch that keeps a child dependent, not a worksheet dressed up as support, but a carefully designed temporary structure that makes success possible, reveals an underlying idea, and then gradually disappears as proficiency grows. And I think this matters well beyond counting. The way we think about scaffolding here tells us something important about early mathematics more broadly. It tells us that if we want children to become genuinely independent, we often have to be much more deliberate about the support we put in place first. So let's begin with the problem itself. When a child struggles to count accurately, what exactly is the barrier? Now, the first thing to say is that counting is not one single skill. Listeners to the podcast will be well aware of this. And it's not just saying the number words in order. It's not just touching some objects while speaking. It's a coordinated performance made up of multiple pieces of knowledge. A child has to know the count sequence, attend to the object or items, keep track of what's already been counted, link each spoken number word to just one item, and come to understand that the final number word tells us how many there are in a set. And if you're 5 years old, sometimes older, that is a lot. And when we compress all of that into the phrase "can count to 10, we hide a huge amount of complexity. So when a child appears to be struggling with counting, our first task is not to assume. Our first task is to observe. What exactly is breaking down? Is the issue the count sequence itself? Is the child unsure of the number of words? I was working with a pupil this week who, when counting to 5, would skip the number 4. Are they losing track of where they started? Are they counting the same object twice? Are they racing through the set without coordinating speech and action? Or are they arriving at a wrong answer, even though the process appears accurate? Now, those are very different problems. Different problems require different responses. And so in this episode, I want to focus specifically on the child who does not yet securely understand one-to-one correspondence. In simple terms, this means they do not yet reliably assign one number word to one object and one object only. So what might that look like in practice? You might place 4 counters in front of a child and ask them to count. And they might say 1, 2, 3, while sweeping across the whole set. Or they might touch one counter twice, or skip one entirely, or push 2 together and assign them a single number word. And if we're only focused on whether the final answer is correct, then we can quite easily miss the deeper issue. The issue is not that the child is careless, although we can all be careless sometimes, can't we? The issue is that one of the principles underpinning accurate counting is not yet secure. And that matters because one-to-one correspondence is not a minor technicality. It's part of what makes counting meaningful. Without it, the numbers are not attached properly to the world. The act of counting becomes unstable. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it does not work. The child has no reliable structure to fall back on. And that's often the point at which we begin to see other things: reluctance, hesitation, guessing, avoidance. A child who appears to dislike counting may in fact be a child who has not yet been given enough support to understand how counting really works. And this is why I think it's helpful to frame counting as difficult in a serious way. Not difficult in the sense of inaccessible, but difficult in the sense of conceptually demanding. Meyer and Land write about threshold concepts as ideas that are transformative, troublesome, and hard won. And while I do not want to force that framework where it does not fit, there's something really compelling about the idea that learning to count changes the way a child can engage with quantity forever. Once you can count, the world looks different. Quantity becomes more precise, more nameable, more comparable, more discussable. That's a major shift. So if the barrier is that the child does not yet know how to assign one number word to one object consistently, the next question becomes, what does the scaffold need to do? And I think this is the crucial question in all scaffolding. A scaffold should not just give more help. It should provide the right help. It should support the exact part of the process that's breaking down. If the child is struggling with one-to-one correspondence, then the scaffold needs to make the oneness of each item more visible, more tangible, more manageable. It needs to slow the process down. It needs to reduce the chance of an item being counted twice, or not at all. It needs to highlight, almost physically, the relationship between the spoken number word and the object being counted. And that is why, for me, the most powerful scaffold here is not something elaborate. It's careful modeling combined with physical action. When teaching children to count, there's no greater scaffold than clear, concise modeling over time and across contexts. But when the specific barrier is one-to-one correspondence, we can sharpen that modeling in particular ways. The first is to make counting physical. If I place 3 cubes in front of a child and simply point while saying 1, 2, 3, that may be fine for some children, but for a child whose one-to-one correspondence is insecure, that model may not be enough. The actions happen too quickly. The objects remain where they are. There is little to distinguish what has already been counted from what has not. But now imagine I put the same 3 cubes in front of the child and say, watch me carefully. I pick up the first cube and move it to a separate space. 1. I pick up the second cube and place it beside the first. 2. I pick up the third and place it beside the others. 3. Now the structure of counting is much clearer. Each number word is attached to one movement and one object. The counted objects have been separated from the uncounted ones. The child can see progression through the set. The process has become visible. And then I might say, now it's your turn. Move each cube as you count it. And the child, perhaps slowly, perhaps hesitantly, begins 1, move, 2, move, 3, move. Now, it may still be the case that the child does not yet fully grasp cardinality. They may not yet understand in a secure way that the final number tells us how many there are altogether. But in that moment, we may well have supported one-to-one correspondence. We've created a structure within which the child can rehearse the right action. And that matters enormously. Because sometimes in early mathematics, we rush too quickly to what the child knows, rather than paying close attention to what the child is doing. Here, the doing matters. The process matters. The visible coordination of action and language matters. I can picture a child in the moment. Let's call her Amira, and she has been heard counting many times. She could sometimes recite number words in order, but when pressed with a small set of objects, she sweeps her hand quickly and says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, regardless of how many there are. Now, it would be very easy to say that she cannot count, but that's much too crude. The more accurate statement might be that she is still assembling what counting is. She has pieces of it, and she needs support to bring them together. So I sit with her, 3 shells on the table, not too many, plenty of space between them. Watch me. 1, move a shell. 2, move the next shell. 3, move the final shell. Then I slide them back. Your turn. She moves the first shell. 1, then pauses. I think that pause matters, because that pause is thought. It's the child trying to coordinate action, attention, and language, and we shouldn't rush to fill it. Then she moves the second shell. 2, then the third. 3. It's a small success, but it's a meaningful one. And because it's meaningful, it's worth rehearsing again tomorrow, the day after, and in another context with other objects, until the process becomes more secure. So the first scaffold is physical manipulation with clear modeling. The second scaffold is the arrangement of the objects themselves. Not all presentations are equal. Some sets are easier to count than others. And if our goal is to help a child develop one-to-one correspondence, then we should think very carefully about how we present the set. A straight line arrangement is often considered easiest. There's a clear beginning and a clear end. The path through the set is obvious. The child does not have to decide where they start or worry so much about whether they have already counted something. And that matters because every extra decision is a source of complexity. If the child is already working hard to coordinate one number with one object, we don't want to overload them with visually confusing arrangements at the same time. So when supporting a novice counter, I would usually begin with a straight line arrangement. Then as the child becomes more secure, I'd move to a tighter grouped arrangement, perhaps an array. Then a more dispersed set with no obvious structure. And finally, at the far end of the difficulty gradient, a circle. The circle is difficult because the start and finish are much less clear. It places a much greater burden on keeping track. I know some children who started counting objects arranged in a circle in 2008, and they're still there to this very day, stuck in a Sisyphean counting task that may never end. And this, for me, is one of the really important ideas in scaffolding. We do not just think about whether a child can do a task or not. We think about the gradient of difficulty within the task. What makes this version easier? What makes that version harder? Which feature should I simplify first, and which feature can I hold steady while I vary another? Now, that kind of decision making is at the heart of a good curriculum design as well. And so, in the story of maths, one of the ongoing decisions is always about what to make visible, what to hold constant, and what to vary. If the mathematical focus is one-to-one correspondence, then the presentation of the objects is not incidental. It's part of the teaching. Now, that might sound obvious, but I do not think it always is in practice. Sometimes we present children with beautiful but busy collections of objects spread irregularly and overlapping slightly, perhaps on patterned backgrounds, and then wondering why counting is unstable. The issue is not simply the child. The issue is that we have not yet controlled the representation enough. And so far, then, we have two powerful scaffolds. First, physically moving objects as they are counted, and second, choosing the easiest possible arrangement first. A third scaffold is adult language, and by that, I do not mean more language. I mean better language, cleaner language, language that directs attention without creating noise. When modeling, I want my words to be simple. Watch me. 1, 2, 3. Now you try. Move each one. Say one number for each object. That's usually enough. What I do not want to do is overload the moment with explanation. A child who's trying to coordinate action and counting doesn't need a paragraph. They need a stable model and a clear cue. Then, during guided practice, I might add very targeted prompts. One number for each cube. Have you counted that one already? Which one will you count next? Can you move it when you say the number? Those prompts support attention. They help the child stay inside the structure of the count. And there's an important professional judgment here. We want to prompt enough to support success, but not so much that the adult ends up doing the thinking. And if I hover over every object, tell the child exactly what to do, and correct them before the mistake is fully formed, I may produce a correct performance without building any real independence. And so the scaffold must support, but it must also leave room for the child to think. And that brings me to another key idea. Scaffold is not the same as simplifying mathematics. It's simplifying access to the mathematics. The mathematical idea here remains the same. One number word for one object. We're not watering that down. We're not lowering the ambition. We're just reducing some of the friction around it so the child can encounter it more successfully. And that distinction matters, because sometimes scaffolding is spoken about as though it dilutes rigor, but the opposite can be true. Good scaffolding allows us to preserve the rigor of the idea while making it learnable. And if we stopped here, we might have a useful set of teaching strategies, but we would still be missing something important: how children move towards autonomy. Because a scaffold is only really a scaffold if it can eventually be removed. So how do we know where to begin? When taking it away. And this is where formative assessment becomes central. The question is not, did the child get it right once? The question is, what does the child do consistently across time and different sets under slightly different conditions? A child who counts 3 cubes correctly once after watching a model has given us useful information, but not enough. It's just mimicry. What we need to know is whether the child can repeat that accurate process tomorrow, whether they can do it with buttons rather than cubes, whether they can do it with 4 objects rather than 3, and whether they can still do it if the objects are in a line but not moved, whether accuracy holds when the support is lightened. So I would think about moving towards independence across 2 continua. The first is distance from the object. At the most supported end, the child moves each object as they count. This makes the count highly visible and highly controlled. Then perhaps the child touches each object but leaves it in place. Then they point to each object, and then eventually they count by looking. That sequence matters because the distance between the child's action and the object gradually increases. The count becomes less physically anchored and more mentally controlled. And again, as mentioned, the second continuum then is presentation. At first, the objects are in a straight line, then in a neat grouped arrangement, then in a more irregular dispersed arrangement, before finally the circular arrangement. And at each stage, we're asking a similar question. Can the child still maintain one-to-one correspondence when the task becomes a little less forgiving? This is where the adult's role as observer becomes absolutely critical. We're watching not just for right answers, but for how the child counts. We're noticing whether their eyes track the objects carefully, whether they hesitate at particular points, whether they lose their place when objects are closer together, or whether they restart mid-count, or whether they understand which objects have already been counted, or whether they just count over and over again when they're asked The total, when they're asked how they know, they default to counting absolutely everything they possibly can. And that observation helps us to make the next decision. Do we remove one part of the scaffold? Do we hold it steady for longer, or do we briefly increase support again? Because progression is rarely neat. A child may count accurately by moving objects in a line, but struggle immediately when the objects are left in place. It's not failure, it's information. It tells us where the edge of current proficiency lies. Let me give you another moment from the classroom. A child has become quite secure in counting 5 counters in a line by moving them. So the next day I present 5 counters in a line again, but this time I say, keep them where they are. Just touch them as you count. The child begins, well, 1, 2, 3, and touches the third counter again, 4. I could simply say, no, that's wrong, but that would tell me very little and teach even less. Instead, I say, okay, let's look carefully. Which one did you already count? Or I might model again very briefly, or I might return to moving one for one before trying touching again. And I think this is the subtle work of scaffolding. It's not a fixed ladder, it's responsive. It depends on seeing the child's current understanding clearly enough to make a good next move. And I think this is one of the reasons why early mathematics teaching can be so intellectually demanding for adults. It requires close observation, careful interpretation, and disciplined decision making. It's not just about enthusiasm and resources. It's about knowing what to look for and knowing what to do next. Now, listeners will have heard me many times say, we need our most expert teachers in the early years, working with our youngest mathematicians, because if we consider these 2 continua alone, and that every child in your class will be on a different point in that continua, knowing how to react and respond, I'm not sure there's anything more complex in teaching than that. So what happens to the child who still needs the scaffold for a long time? Well, first, I think we should resist the temptation to treat ongoing need as a problem in itself. Some children simply need more guided rehearsal, more carefully controlled examples, more opportunities to encounter the same principle in slightly varied contexts. If the scaffold is still doing useful work, if it's still enabling accurate rehearsal of the underlying idea, then keeping it in place for longer is not a weakness. It's good teaching. Secondly, I think we should be precise about which scaffold remains necessary. A child may no longer need the objects arranged in a straight line, but may still benefit from touching them. Another may be able to count by looking in a line, but need more support with irregular arrangement. So again, the point is not whether the child is independent or not in some broad sense. The point is where independence is developed and where support is still needed. And third, we should avoid making independence performative. Sometimes classrooms can subtly communicate that needing a concrete support is somehow inferior, that real success means doing everything mentally and quickly. But if the goal is secure mathematical understanding, then the question is not whether the child looks independent. The question is whether the child is genuinely controlling the mathematics. Now, what impact do these scaffolding approaches have? At the most immediate level, they improve accuracy. Children who were previously skipping objects, double counting, or guessing become more reliable in the act of counting. But I think the impact goes deeper than that. First, the child experiences success in a domain that may previously have felt unstable. That matters for confidence. But I do not mean confidence in the vague sense of feeling good. I mean confidence grounded in having a process that works, feeling success as a mathematician, because we know that success breeds motivation and not the other way around. Secondly, the child's counting becomes more efficient, not because we've rushed them, but because a secure structure eventually allows speed and fluency to emerge. You don't practice until you can get it right. You practice until you can't get it wrong. And third, the child is better prepared for everything that rests on counting: cardinality, comparison, addition, subtraction, grouping, place value, pattern, early multiplicative reasoning. So much of mathematics depends on a stable grasp of quantity. And a stable quantity depends in part on accurate counting. On some level, it's what distinguishes us from the great apes. And the fourth, as we as teachers become more diagnostically precise, we stop saying, this child can't count, and begin saying, this child currently struggling to maintain one-to-one correspondence when objects are not physically moved. Or, this child counts accurately in linear arrangements, but loses track in circular ones. And that kind of precision improves teaching. I think that's one of the most important professional gains here. The child improves, yes, but the teacher's noticing improves too. And when teachers notice better, teaching gets better. If I were looking for a kind of endpoint in this particular journey, a sign that one-to-one correspondence is becoming deeply secure, it might be something like this. A child can accurately count a set arranged in a visually demanding way, perhaps even in a circular formation, without needing to touch or move the objects, and can do so repeatedly. Now, even then, I would be cautious. Human performance is variable. Children have off days. Humans have off days. They may still make the odd slip, but broadly speaking, that kind of accurate, repeatable performance suggests that the child has internalized something important about how counting works. At that point, we can see the broader truth quite clearly. Counting is not a flimsy early skill to be rushed through. There's a woven structure, a set of principles coordinated into action, and one-to-one correspondence is one thread in that weave. And I think there are many fewer mathematical ideas for children to tackle in nursery and reception than there are weeks in the typical academic year. And so let's not rush children through those ideas. Let's really take time to revisit them so that the layers of complexity, the continuum of complexity, we've experienced the mathematics, our pupils have experienced the mathematics in that way. And so when we think about the practical takeaways for teachers, we need to take counting seriously. Not solemnly, but seriously. Look beneath the surface. Do not assume that a child who can chant number words can count accurately. Recitation does not equate to enumeration. The second is to observe before intervening. Watch the count. Look for the precise point of breakdown. Then scaffold the exact difficulty. If one-to-one correspondence is insecure, make the count physical. Use simple arrangements. Model clearly. Keep language tight. And then the fourth is to think in gradients of difficulty, gradients that I've outlined, as I've said before, in the story of mathematics for these ideas, because I think one of the most powerful ways to help our early years colleagues is to outline where exactly their children might be on the various continua of difficulty that exist. And so when we think about this particular example, moving, touching, pointing, looking, line, group, dispersed, circle, we should use those continua to decide what to teach next, what to focus on next. And the fifth is to treat independence as something we build carefully, not something we demand prematurely. We remove the scaffold in response to the evidence, not in response to impatience. There's plenty of time. Get this stuff right early on and children will fly later, I promise you. And for me, this is one of the quiet disciplines of effective mathematics teaching. Seeing complexity where others see simplicity. Slowing down enough to notice what a child is actually doing. Then building a path from dependence to autonomy that's rooted in the mathematics itself. And perhaps that's the final thought I want to leave with. When a child struggles with counting, it can be tempting to view the moment narrowly. I certainly have many times in my career. They got the wrong answer, they need more practice, move on. But if we attend carefully, those moments tell us something much richer. They remind us that mathematics is learned through the gradual coordination of ideas, actions, language, and representation. They remind us that what appears basic is often anything but. And they remind us that skillful teaching is not about making things easy. It's about making important things learnable. So this episode was based on two things. A case study I wrote for The Scaffolding Effect, the fantastic book written by Alex Fairlam and Rachel Ball, but also some work I did during the week. And I thought I need to develop this thinking because the counting work I did with the child was fascinating. But seeing them develop their ability to count and knowing what access that might provide for them is something I want for all children and something I want for all teachers. So, as always, please comment. Let me know what you think of the episode. Slightly different format. It's almost like it's almost a standing room only, but there's definitely no slideshow with this stream of consciousness kind of episode. Until next time, thanks for listening.